Flannery O'Connor is widely considered one of the greatest American authors of the 20th century. She was born in Georgia in 1925, and she actually lived a relatively short life. She didn't make it to age 40. Her father was diagnosed with lupus and died at a relatively young age, and then she, in her late 30s, succumbed to the same illness. But she's an astounding writer in a number of ways and had a deep Catholic faith. For instance, some of us, when we go to sleep at night, engage in some light reading. O'Connor's light reading was the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas Aquinas. And looking at even her short stories, you can see how Catholic faith and the Catholic tradition really permeates her writings.
Yeah, some people, I forget if she coined this or not, but they have called her theology the hillbilly Thomist, that she was able to take something as pristine and the architecture of theology like Thomas Aquinas, but then apply it in these stories known for going overboard, the grotesque nature, the sort of earthy nature of what she talked about. And in that relatively short life, it actually reminds me of Thomas Aquinas, who wrote so much and actually didn't live that long. Flannery O'Connor was the same, wrote prolifically, even though she was ill for most of her adult life. She actually spent part of her time in Iowa. She was at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and especially back then, was really seen as a conduit to become famous in American letters. Lived in New York for a while to start off her career, but then that's when lupus started to take its toll. She goes back to her farm in Midgeville, Georgia, with her mother, where they raise all sorts of things, but one of the big ones she raises is peacocks. And one of the best works you can read, just to get a sense of her ability to show the glory of nature, but also the wry humor that she has, is called King of Birds, where she literally just sort of bashes peacocks for 9/10 of the work, but then in 1/10 of it shows sort of like how splendid they are despite of everything else.
Some of the most fun stories from O'Connor's life have to do with, she was very Southern and grew up in a rural context, and then, like Bo said, after studying at Iowa, she moved to New York, and because of how skilled she was as a writer, she rubbed shoulders with some of the most famous literary figures of the time. But she always had this strong sense that she was called to speak the truth in charity, but not to compromise, regardless of the context. One of my favorite quotes from Flannery O'Connor is, "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it." And she took that seriously. There's a famous story of her at a cocktail party, with sort of the literati. And during this party, or over dinner, there's another person there, a guest, and she says she's someone who's left the Catholic faith, and she's talking about, like, even though I've left the faith, I still look at the Eucharist as this beautiful symbol. And O'Connor, rebutted back, like, if it's just a symbol, to hell with it. And she wrote in her diary later, like, that's the best defense that she could come up with in the moment, but she felt like it was, worth it or important to say something in that context.
Yeah, one of the funny stories from her life, when she was young, she had a chicken that could walk backwards, and she made it in the newspaper, and she basically said her life was downhill from there, which of course is an understatement and a funny joke, as famous as she was even in her own lifetime. But I think it goes to show what we really mean by grotesque. A lot of people who read her works, yeah, she has freaks and weirdos, people who do strange things, people who really are the sort of dregs of Southern society. But she always joked around that Southern works had a lot of freaks and misfits because they still knew what one looked like, and that was a moral achievement. So again, in her sort of wry humor, saying that there's an awareness, a Christ-hauntedness of what she says about the South, where even if people aren't going to church, or even if it's not this perfect society, nay, it's a very sinful society, but it still notices itself as sinners, and that she talks about this being an achievement to look at the peculiarity and particularities of life, and within that seeing grace shining and exploding out of the lives of very specific people. You can see this both in two nonfiction works that she's done. One book is called The Habit of Being, which is just a list of her letters for, again, being sick, not having much time on this earth. She had a very extensive epistolatory life with people that she maintained very deep conversations with, and the sort of humaneness of being able to talk to these people, very indicative of who Flannery is. But she also has a book called Mystery and Manners, which is her essays about writing, both as a Southern writer, as a Catholic writer, and she begins to talk about and show that the incarnation, if it's true, is even going to shape how we write stories. And so if maybe the world wants to call these grotesque, she'd want to call them incarnational. Because if you look at the cross and the crucifix, under a certain light, it's grotesque. It's this execution device. It's this executed peasant. It's the sort of raw power of Rome. But what Christians see in the crucified Lord is the incarnation, God being among us and grace breaking out in strange and powerful ways.
And I think that's why people continue to gravitate towards her literature, because in the stories she captures, she had a very rooted view of the world. She had this real rootedness of living in the South and understanding Southern culture. And so her stories are strangely both grotesque and very humane. And she sees grace and the operation of grace as not God like this super cosmic powerful figure like imposing something abstract or external on human beings, but as operating in the nitty-gritty of everyday life. And in each of her stories, there's usually one moment that as a reader just takes you back. For me, it's probably A Good Man Is Hard to Find, where there's a family on vacation and their car breaks down, and as they're on the side of the road, they're actually robbed and executed by these criminal figures. And at one point in the story, one of the criminals is holding a pistol to the grandmother's head, and O'Connor writes that if she had had a gun held to her head at every moment of her life, she would have been a very virtuous woman. And I don't know about you, but I can identify with that. Like at Mass, if I was, at the altar every moment of my life, I might be able to avoid sin, but I get thrown out into the real world, and grace operates there as well, both in my life and in her stories.
And I think about this especially too, as someone who is from the South, and especially how certain myths about the South can be portrayed. Flannery O'Connor has no romantic image of the South. If you just went by Flannery O'Connor and thought that's what the South was, you would never visit, for instance. But I think that she, in a way, demonstrates what the sort of strange aspect of the South, that if you're from there, you understand why it's a place that has a lot of gravity within it, despite all of its sinful and sorrowful nature. And she shows this, that it's even the least likely person, the person who has the most weighted against him, the person who has done the most to degrade themselves, that precisely where grace pokes through. There's another story called Revelation, where a woman who thinks herself very saintly, she goes to great lengths to show in the sidelights that she's not at all the way that she, for instance, treats...
She's church-going and very polite and
right. And well-to-do, thought of, but she treats the African Americans on her farm terribly. She thinks she's better than all these people. But you want to identify her. You think she's going to be the good person until this young girl in a doctor's office throws a book and hits her in the face and calls her a pig. And like I said, comes out of left field. And you're as surprised as she is, but it's this moment of surprise, of being knocked off her pedestal, that she starts to see a very thin idea about what grace might look like in her life. And it's exactly the opposite of what she thinks. And Flannery O'Connor, for moments like that, is nearly unparalleled, especially in American literature.